She came west looking for a future. He sent her out to die. The rancher who opened his door that night had no idea what he was starting or what it would cost him to finish it. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you stay until the very end, you'll understand why some things are worth fighting for no matter the price. Hit that like button and let's begin. The wind didn't just blow that night, it hunted. It came screaming down from the Absaroka Range like something that had been waiting all winter for exactly this moment, tearing through the Wyoming Valley with a fury that bent the pines sideways and turned the darkness into a wall of white. The temperature had dropped 23 degrees in less than 2 hours. The snow wasn't falling. It was being hurled sideways and sharp as broken glass, driven by gusts that could strip the breath right out of a man's lungs before he had a chance to turn his back. 3 miles from the nearest road on a ridge above the Coldwater Valley, a woman named Clara Marsh was trying not to die. She had been walking for 2 hours. Maybe more. She'd stopped counting when her fingers went numb, and the lantern she'd carried from the edge of the Aldridge property finally gave out its flame, snuffed by a gust that came out of nowhere, and left her in darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. The canvas bag on her shoulder held everything she owned: 2 dresses, a pair of good boots. She'd been too cold to change into a tin of letters tied with twine, and a small brass locket that had belonged to her mother. She held onto the bag's strap the way a drowning person holds a rope, not because she thought it would save her, but because letting go felt like giving up. The drifts came up past her knees in places. Each step was a negotiation with the earth, a small act of will against a mountain that seemed to want her gone. Her coat, a wool traveling coat that had seemed perfectly adequate when she'd bought it in Pittsburgh 3 months ago, was soaked through at the shoulders and stiffening at the hem. Her dress beneath it was plastered against her legs. The cold had moved past pain somewhere on the 2nd mile. Now it was just weight, a heaviness settling into her bones that made every step feel like lifting something she wasn't sure she had the strength to carry. She kept moving because stopping meant dying. That much she understood clearly, with the strange lucidity that comes when the body has stripped everything down to its most essential purpose. Keep moving. Find shelter. Don't stop. She'd been told there was a ranch somewhere up this ridge. One of the women at the Coldwater boarding house, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Dunleavy, who had apologized 3 times that there was no room, had pointed north and said something about a man named Rourke who kept to himself but wasn't unkind. That had been the extent of the directions. North, up the ridge, not unkind. Clara had held onto those words the way she'd held onto the bag strap. Not unkind was the best offer she'd had all day. She had arrived in Coldwater Junction that morning on the 11 o'clock stage from Laramie, and the man who had paid for her passage, every cent of it, including the train ticket from Pittsburgh, and the 2 nights she'd spent at the Laramie Hotel waiting for the connecting coach, had looked at her across the parlor of his ranch house for approximately 90 seconds before reaching his conclusion. His name was Douglas Whitmore. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with the kind of face that photographs well and the kind of eyes that calculated everything they looked at in terms of its return on investment. He owned the Whitmore Land and Cattle Company, which controlled grazing rights on approximately 40,000 acres of Wyoming territory, as well as 3 water contracts, a stake in the Coldwater Junction Bank, and enough political goodwill to make the territorial governor's office answer his letters within the week. He was by every measure that the society pages of Laramie's newspaper used to count such things a catch. He was also, as Clara had discovered in the space of those 90 seconds, a man who had written his advertisement with considerably more poetry than honesty. Seeking a woman of good character and capable disposition, the letter had read to share in the management of a prosperous Wyoming ranch and the building of a life in this great Western territory. The right woman will find here a home, a partnership, and a future built on mutual respect. She had read that letter so many times on the train west that she had memorized it, had held it up to the light of the sleeping car window somewhere in Nebraska, and told herself that the words meant what they said, that mutual respect was not a phrase a dishonest man would use. That partnership implied something real. What Douglas Whitmore had actually meant, she understood now, was something considerably more specific. He had wanted a woman who looked like a rancher's wife was supposed to look. Someone fair-haired and sturdy and pleasant-featured, with the kind of appearance that suggested prosperity and the kind of manner that would reflect well on him at the Cattlemen's Association dinners he attended every spring. Clara Marsh was none of those things. She was 28 years old, dark-eyed and slight, with hands that were rough from 6 years of mill work, and a directness in her gaze that some men found unsettling. She was not plain, at least she didn't think she was, but she was not what the advertisement had conjured in Douglas Whitmore's imagination, and that fact had been visible on his face before she'd even set down her bag. "Miss Marsh," he had said in the tone of a man closing a ledger, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." She had stood very still. "The arrangement I described it requires a certain—" He had paused, reaching for the word with the patience of someone who believed that choosing the right language absolved him of the weight of what he was saying. "Compatibility. Of presentation." "I see," she had said. "I've arranged for you to have use of the bunkhouse for the evening. By morning I'll have—" The advertisement, Clara had said, promised a home and a partnership. It said nothing about presentation. Whitmore's expression had shifted, something hardening behind the silver-haired courtesy. "Advertisements are expressions of intent, Miss Marsh. Intent can change." "I paid for my own train ticket," she'd said. "I came 1,800 miles. "I understand that, which is why I'm offering you tonight's accommodation and $20 for your trouble." She had taken the $20. She had not taken the bunkhouse. Because by the time Whitmore's housekeeper had shown her to the small, airless room behind the kitchen, Clara had already understood something about Douglas Whitmore that she suspected he had never understood about himself. He was the kind of man who believed that paying for something entitled him to return it if it failed to perform as advertised. And she was not a thing that could be returned. She had gathered her bag and walked out into the storm. The light appeared when she had almost stopped believing in lights. It was faint, barely more than a warm smear against the white darkness, visible only because the wind shifted for a moment and the snow thinned just enough to see 20 feet in front of her. But it was there, yellow and steady, coming from somewhere uphill, and to her left, maybe a quarter-mile away, through timber and deep snow. Clara changed direction. She didn't let herself think about what she would do if no one answered. Didn't let herself calculate the odds of a woman alone, soaked through and hypothermic, surviving a night on an open mountainside in January. She just moved toward the light, one foot in front of the other, until the trees thinned and a structure took shape in the darkness, a cabin low and solid with smoke coming from the chimney and lamplight. In one window, real and warm and close enough to touch. She climbed 3 porch steps that she barely felt under her feet and raised her hand and knocked. The sound was swallowed immediately by the wind. She knocked again, harder. Then she waited. For a moment, nothing. She heard the fire inside, the deep contained roar of a good stove working against the cold, and the creak of the structure settling, and the wind trying to tear the porch railing out of her grip. And she thought, if no one answers, I will knock again. And again after that. The door opened. The man who filled the frame was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and the kind of face that had been weathered into stillness by years of weather and solitude. He held a lantern in one hand. His eyes, gray, sharp, absolutely focused, moved over her in one quick assessment, the way a man looks at something that requires immediate action, not consideration. He didn't say anything. He just reached out, gripped her arm just below the elbow, and pulled her inside. His name was Eli Rourke. He did not offer it right away. He was too busy keeping her alive. He got the door closed against the wind and guided her, half-carried her, really because her knees had stopped trusting themselves to the chair nearest the stove. The heat hit her like a physical thing, almost painful after the cold, and she sat with her hands in her lap and tried to remember how to breathe normally while he crouched in front of her and began working at the laces of her boots with quick, impersonal efficiency. The boots were frozen solid. He peeled them off and set them aside, and then produced a heavy wool blanket from somewhere behind her and wrapped it around her shoulders without asking permission, his movements completely matter-of-fact, as though half-frozen women appeared on his porch regularly and the procedure was well established. "Arms up," he said. She tried. Her fingers wouldn't cooperate. They were curled inward and stiff, and when she attempted to lift them, the muscles refused to obey. "The coat," he said, adjusting his approach without any change in expression. He reached around her and unfastened the buttons himself, moving with the same careful impersonality he'd shown throughout, and pulled the wet wool off her shoulders. Beneath it, her dress was soaked through to the skin. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Can you manage the dress yourself? She understood what he meant. The dress was wet enough to be dangerous. Wet clothing pulled heat from the bod faster than no clothing at all, and she was cold enough that it mattered. She tried to reach the buttons at her collar, and her fingers slipped uselessly. No. He turned her gently and worked the buttons from the top down quickly and without hesitation, the way a person performs a necessary task that has nothing to do with anything except the task. When the last button came free, he stepped back. There's a dry shirt on the bed. Get it on and get back to the stove. She did. Her legs were unsteady enough that crossing to the bed and back was an exercise in concentration. And the shirt, a heavy flannel worn soft with use enormous on her, was the warmest thing she'd felt in hours. She wrapped the blanket back around herself and lowered herself into the chair and held out her hands toward the heat and just breathed. He poured coffee from a pot on the stove, black strong smelling, and pressed the cup into her hands. Drink it slow. She did. The first sip burned all the way down, and she held it in her mouth for a moment before swallowing, letting the heat spread. Her hands had begun to shake, which she understood was actually a good sign. Shaking meant her body was still fighting. The man settled into the chair across from her, his elbows on his knees, watching her with the calm attention of someone who has dealt with emergencies before and knows that the first priority is stability. What's your name? He asked. Clara Marsh. Where did you come from, Clara Marsh? She looked at him over the rim of the cup. The firelight caught the lines of his face, mid-30s maybe, with a particular quality of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from long practice at keeping his own counsel. There was nothing alarming in his expression, nothing eager or calculating. He was simply watching her the way a man watches something he's trying to understand. The Whitmore Ranch, she said, south of here, 15 miles maybe. Something changed in his face. Not alarm exactly, more like recognition, the expression of a man who has heard a name he associates with a particular kind of trouble. You walked 15 miles, he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't have another option. In this. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the window where the snow was still hammering the glass. Then back to her. Douglas Whitmore is why you were out in this storm. He decided I didn't meet his standards. She held his gaze because looking away felt like an admission of something she wasn't willing to admit. He gave me $20 and told me to find my own way. The silence stretched. In January, Eli Rourke said, middle of a blizzard. He said the weather was not his concern. Something moved across the rancher's face, brief, controlled, but visible. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flat and cold for just a moment before he pulled them back to neutral. You'll stay tonight, he said. She blinked. The storm won't break until morning at the earliest, probably longer. He stood crossing to the stove. After that, we'll figure out what comes next. I don't have money to pay you. I didn't ask for any. She watched him lift the iron skillet from its hook and set it on the stove, moving with the economical precision of a man who has lived alone long enough that every action in his kitchen has been pared down to its essential steps. Salt pork into the pan, the sizzle immediate and sharp. Beans from a pot already keeping warm. Why? She asked. He glanced back at her. Why what? Why help me? You don't know me. I came to your door. You came to my door half dead, he said simply. That's reason enough. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and watched him cook. His name was Eli Rourke, and he had built this cabin 8 years ago with his own hands in the first winter after he'd decided that the world on the other side of the valley, the world of towns and contracts and men who measured everything by what it was worth to them, was a world he no longer wanted to navigate. He had come to Wyoming from Colorado, where he'd worked cattle for 7 years and watched the land get carved up by men with money and lawyers until the open range he'd known was something you could only find in the older hands' stories. He had used everything he'd saved to buy 200 acres of high country that nobody else wanted and had proceeded to make something of it alone one season at a time. He told Clara none of this that first night. What he told her was where the extra blankets were and that the loft above was warmer than the floor. What he showed her was that the coffee pot was always on and that there was cornbread in the Dutch oven if she woke hungry in the night. What he didn't say, but what she understood nonetheless, was that he was not a man who offered charity. He was a man who made assessments, and whatever assessment he had made of the woman who'd appeared on his porch out of a Wyoming blizzard, it had led him to a decision he seemed to have no intention of revisiting. She climbed the ladder to the loft and wrapped herself in 2 wool blankets and listened to the wind try to pull the mountain apart. And for the first time in 3 months since the morning she'd sent her reply to that advertisement in the Pittsburgh Courier, she slept without dreaming of what came next. And the storm lasted 3 days. Clara had been prepared to stay out of Eli Rourke's way, to occupy as little space as possible and cause as little disruption as the geometry of a one-room cabin allowed. What she discovered in the first hours of that first full day was that staying out of his way was difficult when he was in constant purposeful motion. He was up before Dawn had coffee going and the fire stoked before she'd climbed down from the loft, and was back from his first barn check by the time the light through the snow-covered windows had shifted from gray to pale white. He didn't speak unnecessarily. He didn't fill the silence with the kind of conversational noise that people use to paper over discomfort. He simply moved through the cabin and the tasks of the day with a quiet competence that she found unexpectedly restful. She started helping on the second morning without asking permission. The dishes from breakfast were in the wash basin, and she did them. The firewood near the stove was running low, and she brought more in from the stack on the porch, 2 loads enough to get through the afternoon. She found a broom and swept the cabin floor, which had accumulated the tracked-in evidence of his barn visits and her arrival. He came in from checking the stock and stopped inside the door, taking in what she'd done. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I want to." She set the broom in the corner. "I'm not good at sitting still." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." They ate lunch together, venison stew from the pot he'd had going since morning, thick with carrots and potatoes from the root cellar, and Clara asked him about the ranch. He answered in the way she was coming to recognize as characteristic, direct, specific, without elaboration, but also without evasion. 200 acres, mostly grazing. A herd of 20 cattle, 3 mares, a working stallion, and a quarter horse he used for the mountain trails. The barn he'd rebuilt twice in 8 years, once after a roof collapse, and once after a fire that had taken the whole south wall. "Why this land?" she asked. "It's beautiful, but it's hard. There are easier ranches." He looked at her across the table with those gray eyes that didn't give away much, but didn't hide anything either. "That's why I'm at," he said. She understood him. She realized not everything. He was not a man who made himself easy to understand, but the shape of it. The impulse to find a place that demanded something real of you, to trade comfort for honesty. "I worked in a textile mill," she told him. "Pittsburgh. 6 years. That's hard work. It killed the women around me. Slowly then, all at once." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I watched 3 women my age collapse at their machines in a single year. Lung sickness mostly. The dust gets into everything." She paused. "I decided I'd rather take my chances somewhere else." "So you answered an advertisement." "So I answered an advertisement." The bitterness in her voice was controlled but present. "And ended up at the door of a man who decided I was a poor investment after 90 seconds. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did he say to you exactly?" She told him. Of it, the parlor, the assessment, the $20, the polite language Whitmore had used to wrap something brutal in something acceptable. She told it without drama, just the facts arranged in order, because the facts were damning enough without embellishment. Eli listened without interrupting. His expression stayed neutral throughout, but she noticed his hands. Large, careful hands resting flat on the table had curled slightly at some point during the telling. "He knew about the storm," Eli said when she finished. "It wasn't a question. Everyone knew about the storm. He sent you out anyway. He said it wasn't his concern." The hands on the table stilled completely. When Eli looked at her, his eyes had the particular quality of a man who has reached a conclusion about something and is not going to revisit it. "It's his concern now," he said quietly. Clara didn't ask what he meant. She suspected she would find out. On the 4th day, the wind stopped. The silence woke Eli at dawn, the sudden, enormous absence of the sound that had been constant for 3 days. He lay on his bedroll by the stove for a moment, listening, and then got up and went to the window. The world outside had been remade. Snow lay over everything in deep, smooth drifts, the pines bent almost double under their white weight, the barn barely visible through the stillness. The sky above was the hard, brilliant blue of extreme cold, not a cloud anywhere, just endless depth. He went to the barn to check the horses and found them restless but sound. When he came back, Clara was down from the loft, wrapped in the blanket, standing at the window with her coffee cup in both hands. "It's over," he said, hanging his coat. "Yes." She turned from the window. The morning light caught her face in profile, the dark eyes, the quiet set of her mouth, the specific quality of someone thinking carefully about what comes next. "What happens now?" He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "Now we dig out, check the property for damage, get the stock sorted. And after that," he looked at her directly, "after that, you decide." "Decide what?" "Whether you stay or go." He let the words sit for a moment before continuing. "I could use help on the ranch. Real help, not temporary, not charity. Equal work, equal share of what the work produces." He met her eyes. "But it's your choice. No obligation." She stared at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between surprise and calculation, and something more fragile than either. "Why would you offer me that?" "Because you've already proven you can work, and because I've seen what you're made of." He shrugged slightly. "Seems like useful information." The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "You saw me half frozen and barely upright. I saw you walk 15 miles in a blizzard and not ask me to feel sorry for you once." He pushed off the counter. "That tells me more than most." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the window and the white world beyond it. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay." She stayed and the work began. Clara had expected the ranch to be demanding. What she hadn't expected was how quickly it would become familiar, the rhythm of it, the way each day organized itself around the needs of the animals, and the land leaving no room for the kind of circling anxiety that had been her constant companion in Pittsburgh. Here there was always something specific that needed doing, and doing it took all of you. Eli showed her the routine without condescension: how to check the cattle for frostbite after a hard cold snap, how to read the ice on the creek to know whether it was safe to break through for water, how to split kindling from the pine rounds he kept in the woodyard so the pieces were the right size for starting a morning fire. He explained things once clearly and then let her try. When she made mistakes, and she made them because everything here was new, he corrected her without comment and moved on. She found herself watching him when he didn't know she was watching. Not with the particular attention of attraction, though. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that he was not a man who was difficult to look at. More with the attention of someone trying to understand a new language. He communicated volumes in small things: the angle of his shoulders when he was thinking through a problem, the way he paused with his hand on a fence post, when he'd noticed something that required consideration, the specific silence that meant something was worrying him versus the silence that meant he was simply content to be exactly where he was. The latter, she had noticed, was surprisingly common. 10 days into her stay, they were stacking hay in the barn, dusty physical work that made her arms ache and left chaff in her hair, when she asked the question she'd been holding for a while. "How long have you been up here alone?" He drove the pitchfork into a bale and considered. 8 years, give or take." "That's a long time." "Long enough." "Long enough for what?" He looked at her across the loose hay, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then, "Long enough to figure out who I am when nobody's expecting me to be anything else." She sat with that for a moment. "I spent 6 years in a mill where 300 women did the same thing at the same time in the same way," she said. "You stopped to think you fell behind. You fell behind, you got docked." She leaned against the stall door. "I spent 6 years disappearing into the noise. And coming west was supposed to be different. I traded one kind of invisibility for another, or I tried to." She met his eyes. "It didn't work out the way I planned." "It worked out," he said, picking up the pitchfork again. "Just not the way you planned." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The riders came on the 12th day. Clara was inside mending a tear in her second dress. She'd snagged it on the fence wire during the morning cattle check when she heard Eli's voice from the yard, low and flat, and then a second voice she recognized immediately in the way you recognize something that has frightened you. She went to the window. Douglas Whitmore sat on his horse in Eli's yard, his coat immaculate despite the cold, his silver hair visible beneath the brim of his hat. Beside him rode a younger man, lean and watchful, with a rifle resting easy across his saddle. Whitmore's expression, even at this distance, had the composed authority of a man who does not expect to be refused. Clara set down the dress and went to the door. She heard Whitmore's voice as she stepped onto the porch, smooth, reasonable, carrying the particular cadence of a man who has always found that tone sufficient. Don't want any trouble, Rourke. I simply want what's mine. She's not yours, Eli said. He was standing in the yard with an axe handle in one hand, his posture completely relaxed, his voice as flat and calm as if he were discussing fence line. She never was. She came here under a contract you voided when you sent her out into a January storm with $20 and no shelter. Eli's eyes moved to Whitmore's and stayed there. You want to argue contract law, go ahead. You'll have a hard time finding a judge who'll sympathize once the stories have been told in full. Whitmore's jaw tightened. He glanced past Eli to the porch and saw Clara, and something moved across his face, surprise, then calculation, then the cold composure of a man reformulating. Miss Marsh, his voice was careful, I came to see that you're all right, given the circumstances of your departure. I'm fine, she said. Thank you for your concern. I wonder if we might speak privately. No. The word came out clean and certain without heat. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here. Whitmore looked at Eli, then back at Clara. The younger man with the rifle hadn't moved, but Clara noticed that his hand had shifted slightly on the stock. This is unnecessary, Whitmore said. I'm prepared to be generous. I understand that the situation was handled poorly. I'm willing to offer compensation, a proper sum enough to establish yourself somewhere. I'm already established, Clara said, a pause. I beg your pardon. I'm working this ranch. I have a place here. She kept her voice level. I don't need your compensation. Something crossed Whitmore's face that she hadn't seen before. For something that didn't fit with the silver-haired courtesy, something that came from a place where men who have always gotten what they wanted encounter the specific frustration of being told no. You signed a contract, he said, and his voice had changed. I signed a contract with a marriage broker, Clara said. Not with you. You paid the broker, Mr. Whitmore. You didn't pay me, which means the only binding obligation in this arrangement was yours, and you're the one who broke it. She had rehearsed that, not because she'd known this moment was coming exactly, but because she had spent 12 days thinking through exactly what she would say when it arrived, and the thinking had clarified things considerably. Whitmore stared at her, then at Eli, who had not moved and whose expression had not changed. You're making a mistake, Whitmore said quietly. Both of you. Maybe, Eli said, but it's ours to make. For a long moment, nobody moved. The cold held everything still, the horses, the pines at the yard's edge, the thin smoke rising from the cabin chimney. Then Whitmore pulled his reins and turned his horse in a sharp half-circle. This isn't finished, he said. It is today, Eli said. They watched the two riders move back down the trail until the trees swallowed them. The sound of hoofbeats faded. Clara realized she had been holding her breath and let it out slowly. He'll come back, she said. Yes. Does that worry you? Eli turned to look at her, and his expression was the one she had come to associate with conclusions measured, settled, looking past the immediate thing to what came after it. Whitmore's worried about what you represent, he said. A woman who said no. A contract he couldn't enforce. Men like him don't handle that well. He paused. So yes, he'll come back, and we'll handle it. We, she noticed, not I. She went back and thawed and picked up the mending, and outside the afternoon light moved across the snow, and the valley lay quiet and cold and watchful. And somewhere down the mountain, Douglas Whitmore rode back toward a ranch that was bigger and better equipped and better connected than anything on this ridge, and began to think about what he was going to do next. Clara Marsh threaded her needle and kept her hand steady and thought about it too. That night the fire burned low, and they sat on opposite sides of the table with coffee going cold between them, and Eli said the thing he had clearly been deciding whether to say for the better part of an hour. He's going to try to make this about more than the contract, he said. I know. He'll say things about why you're here, about what kind of woman stays on a single man's ranch. Clara met his eyes. Let him. It could make things harder for you in town. When we go in for supplies, Eli. She waited until she was sure he was listening. I spent 6 years being told that what I did at that mill, the way I lived, the choices I made reflected badly on me in some way I was never quite able to understand. That I should be quieter or smaller or more grateful for the opportunity to be slowly poisoned by cotton dust. She shook her head. I am done letting other people's opinions determine the shape of my life. Whatever Whitmore says about me in town, it is less than what I've already survived. The firelight played across his face. He was watching her with the particular attention he'd shown since the first night, steady, serious, taking in what she said as though it mattered. All right, he said. All right. I just wanted to make sure you understood what might be coming. I understand. She picked up her coffee cup. And I'm still staying. Something shifted in his expression, something quiet and private, that she suspected he hadn't intended her to see. He looked away, back toward the fire. Good, he said. Outside, the mountain was dark and cold and enormous, and down in the valley, Douglas Whitmore was already planning his next move. And in the cabin above the Coldwater Valley, two people who had chosen stubbornness over safety sat by a fire that was theirs and prepared in their own ways for what was coming. The first sign came 4 days after Whitmore's visit, quite enough that it could have been an accident. Eli found the south fence line cut in 3 places, clean diagonal cuts, the kind a man makes with wire snips. Not the ragged breaks that happen when cattle push through. The cattle had wandered through the gap in the night, mixing with a herd that had no business being that far north, and it took the better part of 2 days to sort them out, riding the frozen range in temperatures that turned exposed skin red in minutes and made the horses blow clouds of steam with every step. Clara rode beside him without complaint, learning the ground as she went, following his lead on the cattle work and making up in persistence what she lacked in experience. By the time they'd recovered most of the herd and driven them back through a repaired fence line, her hands were raw beneath her gloves and her back ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. That night at the table, Eli said nothing about the fence. He didn't need to. They both knew what deliberate looked like. 3 days after that, she found the water trough overturned. Not knocked, overturned, the heavy wooden barrel lying on its side in the frozen mud, the water already turned to a sheet of ice across the ground. It had taken 2 people to set it upright again, which told her something about the men who'd done it. Then the tool handles. 3 of them snapped clean through the axe, the splitting maul, the long-handled shovel she used on the barn. Not broken the way tools broke from use, but broken the way things broke when someone put a boot against them and applied deliberate downward force. He's not trying to destroy us, Clara said one evening, sitting at the table while Eli fitted a new handle into the axe head. He's trying to exhaust us. Eli looked up at her. Small things, she said. Nothing you could take to a judge. Nothing that proves anything. Just enough to make every day harder than it needs to be until one of us decides it's not worth it. He set the axe down. You figured that out. I watched a mill foreman do it for 6 years. Different tools, same method. She met his eyes. He'd never fire a woman outright, too much trouble with the other workers. But he could make her station harder to reach, lose her work orders, reassign her to the worst machines. Grind her down until she quit, and he could say he'd never touched her. Eli was quiet for a moment. Whitmore thinks the same way. Whitmore is the same way, she paused. Wealthier, better dressed, same way. He picked up the axe again and continued fitting the handle, his movements steady and unhurried. We keep working, he said. We document what we find. We don't give him the reaction he's looking for. And when the small things stop being enough for him, the questions sat between them in the firelight. Eli didn't answer immediately, and she had learned enough about him to know that the silence was not avoidance. It was honesty. He was thinking it through. Then we deal with that when it comes, he said finally. It was not the reassurance she might have wanted, but it was the truth, and she had come to value his truth above most people's reassurance. They went into town for supplies on a Thursday, the wagon loaded light, and the sky above the Absaroka Range a flat pewter gray that suggested more weather coming. Clara had been in Coldwater Junction only once before the morning she'd arrived on the stage, disoriented from 2 days of travel and full of the kind of hope that hadn't yet been tested. The town had seemed an ordinary then. Now sitting beside Eli on the wagon seat as the main street resolved out of the cold, she saw it differently. saw the way the geography of a small place arranged itself around its most powerful resident. The Whitmore Land and Cattle Company had a visible presence in almost every block: the bank on the corner, where Whitmore held his stake, the land office, where his attorney kept regular hours, the feed merchant, whose primary account was the Whitmore herd. Even the church, he would later learn, had been substantially funded by a Whitmore donation made the same year the territorial water contracts were being negotiated. Eli set the brake in front of the general store and helped her down without comment. A few people on the street had turned to look, not hostile, just attentive, in the way of people who lived in places where arrivals were noted. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust and dried herbs and the specific sweetness of penny candy in glass jars near the counter. The proprietor was a heavy-set man named Aldous Fenn, with a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough of human nature to find most of it unsurprising. "Rourke," he said, nodding. Then, with a careful neutrality, "Miss Clara Marsh," she said, meeting his eyes. "I'm working the Rourke ranch." Something moved briefly across Aldous Fenn's face, the small adjustment of a man updating his inventory of local facts, and then he nodded again. "What can I get you?" Eli handed him the list. While Fenn moved along the shelves, Clara walked the store's perimeter, running her fingers along bolts of canvas fabric, jars of preserved fruit, a display of sewing notions she examined with professional attention. She was looking at a spool of heavy thread when the door opened and two women came in. She knew from the quality of the silence that followed that this was significant. The first woman was perhaps 50, impeccably dressed for a town of this size, with sharp eyes and the posture of someone accustomed to being the first to speak. The second was younger, late 20s, blonde, with a careful prettiness and the specific expression of someone who was always watching to see how things landed. "Mr. Rourke." The older woman's voice was pleasant in the way of a blade that has been well maintained. "I heard you'd taken in a visitor." Eli at the counter turned with the unhurried ease of a man who had been expecting something like this. "Mrs. Aldridge." "Miss Aldridge." The older woman and Clara understood then that this was the family of the boarding house. The Mrs. Dunleavy, who had apologized about the full rooms, turned to her assessment toward Clara with the comprehensive efficiency of long practice. "So this is the young woman," she said. "Clara Marsh," Clara said before Eli could speak. "Yes. I understand you had quite an ordeal." The sympathy in Mrs. Aldridge's voice was genuine enough in its surface texture. "Douglas Whitmore's situation was unfortunate, though I must say these arrangements can be unpredictable. When a woman comes west under those circumstances—" "Under those circumstances," Clara said, "a woman boards a train and travels 1,800 miles in good faith, responding to a written agreement that promised specific things. When that agreement is broken by the other party, it's not the circumstances that are unpredictable. It's the man." Mrs. Aldridge's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm not criticizing Mr. Whitmore's character," Clara continued, which was not entirely true. "I'm describing what happened. He made promises he didn't keep and sent me away in conditions he knew were dangerous. I found shelter. I found work. I'm grateful for both." The younger woman, the daughter Clara presumed, whose name she didn't yet know, stepped forward with a smile that had too many teeth in it. "It must be a relief," she said, "having somewhere to land, even if it's unconventional." The word was deployed with precision. Unconventional. Meaning a single woman on a single man's ranch. Meaning what people will say. Meaning you should be ashamed of yourself. Clara looked at her directly. "I've worked every day since I arrived. I've earned my keep. If that's unconventional, I'll survive the label." "It's not the work people will question," the young woman said. "Eliza." Eli's voice was quiet, but it carried. Eliza Aldridge looked at him, then away, her smile thinning. "We're just concerned," Mrs. Aldridge said, recovering smoothly, "for propriety, for your reputation, Miss Marsh, and for Eli's, of course. He's been a respected part of this community for years, and he opened his door to someone who would have died if he hadn't," Clara said. "That tells me exactly what kind of man he is. I suspect the community knows it too, or he wouldn't have that reputation." She paused. "Is there something else you'd like to say, Mrs. Aldridge? Because we have supplies to collect." The silence in the store had a specific texture, the held breath of a room waiting to see how something resolved. Aldous Fenn behind the counter had stopped moving. His arms were folded across his chest, and his expression was that of a man who had just revised his assessment of something. "Mrs. Aldrich drew herself up. I see you have strong opinions, Miss Marsh. I have accurate ones, Claire said. There's a difference. The two women made their purchases with the brittle courtesy of people who have decided to postpone a conflict rather than abandon it and left. The door swung closed behind them, and the room seemed to exhale. Aldous Fenn finished packing the supplies. When he slid them across the counter, he looked at Clara for a moment, with an expression that was she thought something close to approval. You'll find, he said, that some folks around here have gotten used to things being a certain way. I noticed, she said, Whitmore's had influence in this valley a long time. I noticed that too. Fenn nodded slowly. Influence has a way of convincing people that the man who has it is always right. He paused. Take someone new to remind them it doesn't work that way. Eli picked up the supplies. We good, Aldous. You're paid up. Fenn met Eli's eyes. You watch yourself, Rourke. Whitmore came in here 2 days ago. Asked me questions about your operation. Supply needs credit standing. He paused. I told him what I tell everyone who asks about my customer's business, which is nothing. Fenn's expression was mild. Have a safe ride back. The ride home was quieter than the ride in. The sky had lowered while they were in town, the pewter gray deepening toward the color of a bruise, and the first few flakes were beginning to drift down by the time they cleared the last of the tree line and started up the ridge trail. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and watched the mountains and thought about the way Mrs. Aldridge's face had changed when she'd pushed back. The surprise in it, the recalibration. She had expected a woman who would be apologetic, perhaps someone who understood her position to be precarious, and was grateful enough for the shelter to remain carefully agreeable. You're thinking, Eli said. Constantly, she said. It's a habit I can't break. The corner of his mouth moved. What about Mrs. Aldridge? The way she looked at me when I didn't behave the way she expected. Clara paused. She's not a bad woman. She's a woman who's learned which direction the wind blows in this valley and made her arrangements accordingly. Most people have. I know, I'm not judging her for it. She looked at the snow beginning to settle on the trail ahead of them. I'm just aware that it means the people here will find it easier to believe Whitmore's version of things than mine, not because it's true, but because believing his version cost them less. Eli was quiet for a moment. That's true, he said. Up to a point. What's the point? The point where what he does becomes impossible to ignore. He kept his eyes on the trail. Men like Whitmore operate in the space between what everyone knows and what anyone's willing to say out loud. They count on people not wanting the trouble of saying it. He paused, but they miscalculate sometimes. Push too hard. Do something visible enough that looking away requires more work than speaking up. You think he'll push that hard? I think he's already decided he will. Eli looked at her sidelong. He came to my door and asked for you back. When that didn't work, he started with the fence and the tools. That's a man escalating. And the next step, he didn't answer right away. The snow was coming down more steadily, now the flakes larger, and the ridge above them had disappeared into white. Something that makes a point, he said finally. Something visible. Clara thought about that for the rest of the ride home, and that night she sat at the table with paper and ink and wrote a careful, comprehensive letter to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, describing in factual terms everything that had happened since her arrival, the broken contract, the dangerous abandonment, the subsequent harassment, the specific dates and details she had been keeping in the small notebook she'd started the day after Whitmore's first visit. She listed the cut fence sections, the overturned trough, the broken tool handles. She noted the timing. She described the two riders who had come to the ranch and what had been said. She was not naive enough to think the letter would stoke what was coming. She was enough of a realist to understand that a territorial marshal responding to the complaint of an unknown woman against a man of Whitmore's standing was not a guaranteed outcome. But a letter created a record made lying harder. And if things did escalate further when they escalated further, the record would matter. Eli read the letter when she was done and added 2 paragraphs in his own hand, signed and dated, corroborating her account and adding details she hadn't had. You'll want to post it yourself, he said. From town, not from here. I know. She folded the letter into its envelope. I don't trust everything that leaves this ridge to arrive where it's going. He looked at her steadily. You've thought this through. I've had time. She met his eyes. I'm good at thinking through things that matter. The fire was burning low and the snow outside had settled into the deep quiet of a serious snowfall, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The silence had the particular quality she had come to associate with the cabin at its most itself, thick with warmth and wood smoke, in the presence of two people who had chosen in their different ways to stop running. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. When I knocked on your door that night, what did you think when you saw me? He considered. That you had about 30 minutes left. That's not what I mean. He looked at the fire. I thought you were someone who'd made a decision not to quit. A pause. That was visible even then. She absorbed that. And now he turned to look at her, and his expression had the quality she found both most difficult and most valuable in him, completely honest without the softening that most people applied to honesty when to make it easier to deliver. Now, I think you're the most clear-eyed person I've met in 8 years, he said. And I've been alone for 8 years, so the competition isn't fierce. But still. She laughed genuinely, the kind of laugh that surprised her on its way out. It felt unfamiliar in her own chest, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a while, remembering its function. That might be the strangest compliment I've ever received, she said. It's not strange. It's accurate. He looked back at the fire. You said there's a difference between accurate and kind, between accurate and what people usually offer. She thought about that. Most people offer what they think you want to hear. Yes, and you don't. I find it wastes time. He picked up the poker and adjusted the log in the stove. You deserve the truth. You've been given enough of the other thing. The silence settled again, and this time it had a different quality, warmer weighted with something that didn't need to be named yet, but was present in the room with them as surely as the fire and the snow and the dark outside the window. Clara gathered the letter and her pen and put them in the small box where she kept her papers. When she looked up, Eli was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, open in a way that his face usually wasn't, the careful, neutral composure absent for just a moment. Then it was back, and he stood and banked the fire. You should sleep, he said. We've got fence work in the morning. I know, she said. Good night, Eli. Good night. She climbed the loft ladder and lay in the dark and listened to the snow fall on the roof and thought about a man who told the truth because he thought she deserved it, and felt something shift in the careful architecture of her interior life. A wall that had been standing for a very long time, bearing the weight of everything she had not allowed herself to want, beginning very quietly to lean. The letter went to Cheyenne on a Tuesday. Whitmore's next move came on a Friday. Clara was in the barn working on a piece of harness leather that had cracked along one of the cheek pieces when she heard Eli's voice outside go flat and controlled in the way it did when something required his full attention. She set down the leather and went to the barn door. 3 men had ridden in from the south trail, not Whitmore this time, but the lean young man who had ridden with him before, flanked by 2 others she didn't recognize. They were stopped 10 yards from the porch, their horses standing easy, their postures carrying the relaxed readiness of men who had been sent to deliver something unpleasant and were comfortable with the work. Eli stood in the yard with his thumbs in his belt and said nothing. The young man spoke first. His name, Clara would later learn, was Garrett, and he was Whitmore's ranch foreman's younger brother, which explained both his presence and his confidence. Mr. Whitmore sent us with an offer, Garrett said. He's prepared to pay fair value for this property. Good price, more than the land is worth on the open market. He's being generous. I'm not selling, Eli said. He thought you might say that. So he asked me to mention that the water rights on your south pasture come up for renewal in March. Mr. Whitmore has some influence with the territory's water commission. Garrett's tone was conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. He'd hate to see good grazing land go dry. Clara stepped out of the barn. Garrett's eyes moved to her, registered her presence, and continued. He'd also like Miss Marsh to know that her situation, a woman living unchaperoned on a single man's property, has been a topic of some conversation in town. He's concerned out of genuine goodwill that her reputation may suffer if the arrangement continues. Tell Mr. Whitmore, Clara said, that my reputation is my own business. He anticipated that response too. Garrett almost smiled. He said to tell you that the territorial court in Laramie handles breach of contract cases twice yearly, March and September. He has a lawyer prepared to argue that you abandoned a legal agreement and are therefore in debt to him for the cost of your passage west. The ground shifted slightly under her feet, but she kept her face still. I have documents that contradict that argument. Documents can be challenged. So can lawyers. She met his gaze. Tell Mr. Whitmore I look forward to the opportunity to present my case in full, in a public courthouse, where everyone present will hear exactly why I left his property. Something flickered in Garrett's expression, the faint surprise of a man who had expected less resistance. He glanced at Eli, found nothing useful there, and looked back at Clara. He won't stop, Garrett said. And for just a moment, the conversational ease dropped, and what was underneath was something closer to genuine. I'm telling you that as a fact, not a threat. He doesn't stop. Neither do I, Clara said. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled his reins, and the three men turned and rode back down the trail. When they were gone, Eli stood in the yard without moving for a while, his eyes on the tree line where the riders had disappeared. Then he turned to Clara. The water rights comment, he said. That one's real. I know. If he pulls the renewal, the south pasture goes dry by summer. I lose a third of my grazing capacity. I know. She walked toward him across the frozen yard. Is there anything we can do about it before March? His jaw was tight. I can file a competing claim. It'll be expensive, and it might not hold if Whitmore's commissioner is already in his pocket. He paused. But it creates a paper trail, makes it harder for them to act without a hearing. Then we do that. She stopped in front of him and looked up at his face, reading the specific quality of his tension. Not fear she had learned, but the controlled anger of a man who knows he is being outmaneuvered on terrain that matters to him. Eli, we do that and we document everything else, and we keep working and we don't give him what he wants, which is the satisfaction of watching us break. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted the anger still there. But underneath it, something else, something she had been carefully not naming for the past several weeks, because naming it required acknowledging that she was letting herself want things again, which was not a safe activity for a woman in her position. You're not afraid, he said. I'm afraid constantly, she said. I just don't let it make my decisions. His mouth moved a particular movement she had come to recognize as the closest he usually got to a full smile, a thing of compressed warmth that appeared rarely and was worth the wait. All right, he said, then we keep going. They went back to work. Did you? That night, the temperature dropped another 15 degrees, and the sky over the Absaroka Range lit up with stars so dense they looked like scattered flour on black cloth. Clara sat on the porch for a few minutes before bed, wrapped in Eli's heavy coat that she had borrowed without asking, and returned without mentioning, watching the stars and letting the cold clear her head. She thought about Douglas Whitmore sitting in his large, warm, impeccably furnished ranch house, calculating her next move the way a chess player calculates an opponent's response. She thought about Garrett's genuine warning, he doesn't stop, and what it meant that one of Whitmore's own men had felt compelled to say it. She thought about what it meant to fight a man who had everything and decide to fight him anyway. She had left Pittsburgh because staying meant a slow diminishment, the gradual erosion of what she was in the service of what was expected of her. She had come west because she had believed with a faith that the advertisement had encouraged and Whitmore had comprehensively destroyed, that there was a place in this country where a woman could be defined by her own choices. It turned out there was such a place. It was 200 acres of hard country on a Wyoming ridge, tended by a man who asked nothing from her except that she be exactly what she was. She was not going to let Douglas Whitmore take it from her. The door opened and Eli appeared holding 2 cups of coffee. Too cold to be out here, he said, handing her one. I know. She took it. I was thinking. I could tell. He leaned against the porch post, looking at the same sky she'd been watching. Come to any conclusions? Several. She wrapped her hands around the warmth. He's going to escalate. The water rights threat was the beginning of the serious phase. He's been testing us with small things, and now he's moving to larger ones. Yes, which means we need allies, not just a record. Actual people in this valley who are willing to say what they know. He was quiet for a moment. Aldous Fenn might talk. He's seen enough over the years. The blacksmith, she said, remembering. When we were in town, he tipped his hat. Eli glanced at her. Marcus Webb. He's been here longer than Whitmore. Doesn't owe him anything. Then we start there. She took a long drink of coffee. We need people who will speak up when the time comes, because the time is coming. He turned to look at her in the cold starlight, and his expression had the particular quality she had learned to value above all his other expressions, the one that meant he was taking her seriously. Not managing her, not deciding for her, taking her seriously. All right, he said, we build that. She nodded and they stood together on the porch in the cold and the dark, and the stars burned overhead, indifferent and magnificent, and the valley below them held its breath. Somewhere down that valley, Douglas Whitmore was done being patient, and in the morning they would find out what that meant. The morning came gray and still, the kind of stillness that had weight in it. Eli rode the south fence line before breakfast and found what he'd half expected to find. The water gate on the creek diversion had been forced open overnight, draining the secondary channel that fed the stock troughs in the lower pasture. It wasn't a catastrophic act. The damage was repairable. The water could be redirected in a few hours, but it was deliberate and it was new. They had moved from above-ground harassment to infrastructure, from statements to sabotage. He came back and told Clara over coffee, without inflection, the way he told her most things. She listened, set her cup down and said, "How long to fix it?" "Half a day if the gate mechanism isn't cracked. And if it is, full day, maybe longer." He paused. "I'll need to bring materials up from the lower barn. Then I'll take the morning cattle check while you get the materials." She stood pushing back from the table. "And when we're done, we go see Marcus Webb." He looked at her. "We said we'd start building," she said. "We start today." Marcus Webb's smithy sat at the east end of Coldwater Junction's main street, set slightly apart from the other buildings as if the town had given it a respectful distance on account of the noise and heat it generated. The forge was going when they arrived, visible through the open double doors as a pulsing orange heart, and Marcus himself was working a length of iron at the anvil, a broad man in his 50s with forearms like bridge cable and burn scars climbing both wrists to the elbow. He looked up when they came in and set down the hammer without hurry. "Rourke," he said, and then studying Clara with the calm directness of a man who did not perform either hostility or welcome until he'd made up his own mind, "Miss Marsh." "You know my name," she said. "Small town." He wiped his hands on his leather apron. "What can I do for you, Shum?" Eli said. "We're not here for ironwork." Marcus looked at him steadily. "I figured." He gestured with his head toward the back of the smithy, where a rough bench and 2 stools stood against the wall, away from the forge's heat. "Come on, then." They sat and Clara told him everything. She used the same structure she'd used in the letter to Cheyenne fax dates sequence. But she watched his face as she spoke and adjusted the telling, accordingly adding the details that made his eyes sharpen and moving past the ones that didn't. Marcus Webb was not a man who needed emotion. He needed accuracy. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then Watergate. "Last night," she said, "he's moving to the infrastructure." Marcus turned a cold iron rod end over end in his hands, a habit of thought. "That's new. He's been patient up till now, fence tools, that sort of thing. Infrastructure means he's decided patience isn't working." "That's our read too," Eli said. "The water rights claim," Marcus said. "March renewal." "Yes. I know the commissioner." He set the rod down. "Harlan Briggs. He's been in Whitmore's pocket since the Creek rights of '81. He'll do what Whitmore tells him." A pause. "But he's also nervous. He was appointed by the previous territorial governor, whose replacement has been making noises about accountability. Briggs does what Whitmore tells him, but he does it quietly, and he doesn't like exposure." Clara felt something sharpen in her thinking. So if the renewal process became public, if it became public and contested, Marcus said, Briggs would find a reason to rule neutrally. He won't go against the Whitmore, but he won't go against the wind either if the wind is blowing hard enough. He looked at Clara. "You'd need more than just Rourke filing a competing claim. You'd need people talking, people in town who have standing, who'll say openly that they support the claim." "Would you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long, considering moment. "I've been in this valley 23 years, he said. "Whitmore's been in it 17. And in those 17 years, I've watched him buy up water rights that didn't need buying, acquire land through contracts that had a smell to them, and make enough trouble for people who crossed him that most folks stop crossing him. He paused. I've kept my head down because I have a business to run and a family to keep, and getting into Douglas Whitmore's crosshairs seemed like a poor investment of whatever years I've got left. Another pause longer. But then I watched a woman come into this town after walking 15 miles through a January blizzard because he threw her out and stand in Aldous Fenn's store and tell Margaret Aldridge the truth to her face, and I thought, well, what? Clara said. I thought that was the bravest damn thing I'd seen in a long time, he said, and that maybe it was past time for me to stop calculating. He held out his hand large and scarred and absolutely steady. Clara shook it. Aldous Fenn was next. Then a rancher named Samuel Holt, who had his own complicated history with a Whitmore water contract and had been waiting with the patience of a man who has learned to wait for circumstances to change. Then the postmaster, a quiet man named Carr, who had been noting things he received and sent for years and had a particular memory for patterns. It took 2 weeks of careful individual conversations, nothing loud, nothing that looked like organizing. Just people talking, honestly to people they trusted, about things that were true. Clara did most of the talking. She discovered better at it than she'd expected, better than Eli, who was respected, but laconic in ways that sometimes worked against him in these conversations. She had spent 6 years in a mill, learning to read people quickly and speak in ways that reached them, and those skills had not gone away simply because the setting had changed. Eli watched her work and said almost nothing about it, but she could feel his attention steady, assessing, increasingly certain. One evening, riding back from a visit to Samuel Holt's ranch, he said, "You're building a case." "I'm building a community," she said. "The case is what it produces." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a difference. A big one." She watched the trail ahead of them. "A case is adversarial. It's me against Whitmore, my documents against his lawyers. A community is something else. It's people deciding together what they're willing to accept and what they're not." She paused. "Whitmore's had influence here because no one's organized that question before. And now you are. Now we are." He glanced at her sidelong, and she caught the quality of his expression in the last of the daylight, something she had seen only rarely in moments when he was off guard or simply tired enough that the careful, neutral composure slipped. Something that looked, she thought, very much like admiration. She looked away before he could see that she'd noticed. The snow came again in the second week of February, not a blizzard but a steady, heavy fall that kept them close to the cabin for 3 days, and gave the mountain the particular suspended quality of a world that had decided to pause and think. They were by now in the habit of each other. The cabin that had seemed small in the first days had become not larger exactly, but more efficiently inhabited the space between them, organized by the logic of two people who had learned to anticipate each other's movements. She knew that he took his coffee strong and let it go cold before he drank half of it. He knew that she worked better with conversation than silence in the mornings, and better with silence than conversation in the evenings. They had developed, without discussing it, a system for the morning barn checks that divided the work along lines of respective competence and adjusted fluidly when conditions required. On the second snowbound evening, sitting by the fire with nothing urgent, demanding either of them, Eli said something he had clearly been deciding whether to say for some time. "I had a wife," he said, "in Colorado before I came here." Clara looked up from the mending she was doing. He was staring at the fire, his elbows on his knees. "What happened?" she asked. "She left." He was quiet for a moment. "Not because of anything dramatic. Because I was absent, not physically. I was there, but I was somewhere she couldn't reach most of the time, and eventually she decided she didn't want to keep reaching." He paused. She was right. I wasn't giving her anything to hold on to. Clara set down the mending. "How long ago?" 9 years. We'd been married 3 years. And then you came here. And then I came here." He picked up a piece of kindling from the basket and turned it in his hands, the habit of thought she had come to recognize. "I thought I told myself that being alone was what I needed, that the problem had been proximity, that if I just removed myself from the situation where my failures were visible, I could—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought I could do." "Fix yourself by yourself," she said. He looked at her. "I tried the same thing," she said. "In a different way. The mill was, I told myself I was being independent, self-sufficient, that not needing anything from anyone was strength." She paused. "It wasn't strength. It was just a very convincing fear. He held her gaze. Yes. Are you still afraid? The question sat in the room between them, and she felt the risk of it, the exposure, the way it could go wrong if he was not what she had come to believe he was. Of being absent again. He looked back at the fire. Yes, I don't know how not to be. A long pause. Oh, but I notice I'm present with you. More than I've been in a long time. The fire crackled. The snow fell on the roof. I noticed the same thing, she said. And then because she had decided to stop letting fear make her decisions, that terrifies me. He looked at her. I came here trusting a letter, she said, a stranger's words on paper. And I was wrong to trust them, and it nearly killed me. She held his gaze. You are not that stranger, but I am still the woman who learned to be very careful with trust. I know, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. I know you're not. She paused. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know it. The same way you tell me things. He absorbed that, and the stillness that followed was not the absence of response, but its most considered form. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and careful. I'll wait, he said, for whatever pace makes sense to you. You might wait a long time. That's all right. She looked at him, this quiet, difficult, thoroughly honest man, and felt the wall that had been leaning for weeks lean a little further and let it. Go to sleep, Eli, she said. We've got fence work tomorrow. He almost smiled. Good night, Clara. She climbed the loft ladder and lay in the dark and listened to the snow and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, think about the future without bracing for it. 3 days after the snow stopped, they found the dead calf. It was in the north pasture near the tree line, a heifer calf born late in the season that had been healthy the morning before. It lay in the snow with its legs folded under it, and when Eli crouched beside it and examined it, his jaw went tight in a way Clara had learned to read. Poisoned, he said. She crouched beside him. How? Something in the water or the feed. He straightened. I'll need to check the others. He paused, looking at the calf. This one was just bad luck, right place, right time. Or wrong. His voice was controlled in the way that meant something was costing him considerable effort to control. He's telling me he can reach the animals. The implications settled over her like cold water. He's willing to kill livestock, she said. He's willing to do whatever it takes. Eli turned away from the calf. We need to talk to Tom Garrett. At her questioning look, town constable. He's not powerful and he owes Whitmore favors he hasn't finished repaying. But he keeps records. If I come to him with a dead calf and evidence of poisoning, we'll see, he has to write it down. He paused. And when he writes it down, it's official. It becomes harder to dismiss. And if he buries it, then we know exactly where he stands and we take it over his head. He started walking back toward the barn. Either way, we know more than we knew this morning. She fell into step beside him. He's not going to stop at a calf. No, Eli said, he's not. Then we need to be ready for what comes after. He glanced at her, and for just a moment, she saw the full weight of what this was costing him, 8 years of careful, hard-built life on these acres. The animals, the fences, the land he had chosen precisely because it required everything he had to give. The thing he had built not to show anyone, but because building it had been the way he'd learned what he was made of. And now a man with a checkbook and a water commissioner was systematically trying to take it apart. She reached out and touched his arm, brief light, the contact she had permitted herself in the weeks since their conversation by the fire, when the wall had begun carefully to come down. He stopped and looked at her. We're going to win this, she said. You don't know that? No, she admitted, but I'm choosing to believe it, because the other option is giving up, and I haven't come this far to do that. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that saw clearly and said what they saw. No, he said, you haven't. They went to see the constable that afternoon, and Eli laid out what they knew in his flat, factual way, and Tom Garrett wrote it down with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was being asked to put on record and had decided after a visible internal negotiation to put it there. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even close. But it was a mark in a book, and marks in books had a way of accumulating into things that mattered. That night, Clara wrote another letter to Cheyenne. This one included the calf. They were returning from town on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of February when Eli spotted the smoke. It was coming from the direction of the barn, not the thin white smoke of the cabin stove, but black and thick, climbing hard against the cold sky with the particular urgency of something that was consuming more than it should. He didn't say anything. He just spurred the horse. Clara was right behind him. They came over the ridge and she saw it. The barn's north wall was burning the dry winter wood, catching with a speed that made her stomach drop. The horses inside were already making noise. She could hear them from 50 yards out, the high panic sound that horses made when they smelled fire and couldn't run from it. Eli was off his horse before it fully stopped. "Get the cattle gate open," he shouted. "I'll get the horses." She was already running. The cattle gate was around the south side away from the fire, and she got it open and pushed the terrified animals out into the pasture, counting as they went 3, 4, 5, the animals bolting into the cold air in the space beyond the fence with the single-minded urgency of creatures that understood only a way. She got all 6 out and turned back toward the barn. The north wall was fully involved now. She could see the flames through the gap in the barn door sheets of orange, climbing in the dry boards, the smoke black and acrid and thick enough that she could taste it from 20 feet away. Inside, horses screamed. Eli came out with the first one, the bay mare dragging her by the halter with both hands while she fought him, too frightened to understand that the person pulling her was pulling her towards safety. He got her through the doors and handed her off. Clara grabbed the halter and pulled while Eli turned back. She got the mare to the fence post and tied her and went back. Eli was coming out with the roan gelding, both of them half invisible in the smoke pouring through the doors. She took the gelding, tied him, went back again. The third horse came out hard, nearly pulling Eli off his feet, and Clara caught it on the other side and held on while it tried to bolt her arms, burning with the effort, until the animal's panic subsided enough for her to lead it to the fence. 2 more to sneeze. The smoke was coming heavier now, and the roar of the fire inside the barn had deepened into the sound of structural failure, the sound of something large and old giving way. Eli went back in. Clara tied the third horse and followed him. Inside was a world of orange and black. The smoke hit her instantly. She put her arm over her face and squinted through it, following the sound of Eli's voice, the rough, urgent sounds he was making at the horse in the last stall. She could see him through the haze. The fourth horse was down, panicked to the floor, and he was on his knees beside it, one hand on its neck, his voice low and continuous, enforcing calm into the animal through sheer will. She got to the other side of the horse and added her hands to the effort, both of them pressing down and steadying until the animal's legs found the floor and it lurched upright. A section of the north wall buckled inward with a crash, and burning debris rained down, and she felt the heat of it across her shoulders and the back of her neck. They got the horse to the doors and out into the cold, and she took it to the fence while Eli turned back. "One more," he said. "Eli, the wall, one more." He was already back inside. She went after him. The last horse was in the far corner, the most dangerous position, the fire between them and the door. The animal was wild-eyed and screaming, and Eli had the halter but couldn't move it. It was pressed against the back wall and shaking, and the heat in the barn had become something that pressed against exposed skin like a hand. Clara grabbed a length of burlap from a peg near the stall and shoved it into Eli's hands. He understood immediately, threw it over the horse's head, covering its eyes, and the animal went from violent terror to trembling stillness in the way that blinded animals sometimes did, the danger they couldn't see becoming manageable. In a way, the danger they could see was not. They moved it. Fast, Eli in front, and Clara pushing from behind through the smoke and the falling debris and the heat that was no longer discomfort but genuine danger, out through the doors and into the cold air that hit them like a plunge into water. The barn collapsed behind them 7 minutes later, she counted. She was sitting in the snow with her back against the fence post and her lungs burning, and she counted the seconds between the time they came out and the time the structure came down, because counting was something to do that was not thinking about how close it had been. Eli sat beside her. Both of them were black with soot. His coat had a burn mark across the left shoulder that hadn't been there before. "All 5, she said. "All 5. He was breathing hard. "You went back in for the last one." "Yes." "That was—" She stopped. "Don't do that again." He looked at her, and his expression was the open one, the one he couldn't always control. "I had the same thought about you," he said, "when you followed me." She met his eyes. We do it together or not at all, she said. That's what we said. He held her gaze and she saw what moved through his expression, not agreement exactly, but something deeper, an acknowledgement, an alignment. Together, he said. Behind them, the barn continued to burn, and on the ridge above the property, 4 riders sat on their horses in the gathering dark and watched, and one of them raised a slow hand before they turned and disappeared. Clara saw them. She noted the number, the direction, the timing, and she understood that they had just entered the final phase of Douglas Whitmore's campaign, and that he had miscalculated. By dawn, the valley knew. Word traveled the way word traveled in places where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and news was a currency people spent carefully, but spent fast through riders at first light, through smoke visible from ridge lines, through the specific quality of silence on a party telephone line that told you someone was listening before they picked up. Marcus Webb arrived first, his horse lathered from the ride up the ridge trail, the big man swinging down in Eli's yard with the expression of someone who had made a decision on the way and wasn't revisiting it. "Tell me what happened," he said. Eli told him. Brief, factual, while Clara built the fire back up in the cabin and put coffee on and listened from the doorway. Marcus listened with his arms folded and his eyes on the blackened outline of what had been the barn. When Eli finished, Marcus said, "The riders on the ridge. 4 of them. You recognized any 2, Garrett and one of the other men who came to the ranch with Whitmore." He paused. "It wasn't dark yet. I saw clearly." Marcus unfolded his arms. "That's not just harassment anymore." "No," Eli said. "That's arson. And with people inside." He stopped. "That's attempted murder." The words sat in the cold air between them. Clara came out of the cabin with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Marcus. He took it automatically, still looking at the ruins. "I'm going to talk to people," he said. "Today, before Whitmore has a chance to get his version out first." He looked at Clara. "You said the same thing to me 3 weeks ago. Now I'm saying it to you. The story that spreads first is the story people believe. We need the true one moving." "Who do we start with?" Clara asked. "Samuel Holt. The Dunleavy brothers, they've got the largest spread east of the Basin, and they've had their own quiet trouble with Whitmore's water games." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "And Tom Garrett, the constable." Eli's voice was careful. He's a man who wrote down what you told him last week about the dead calf," Marcus said, "and who I happen to know spent 15 years working cattle before he took the constable job and does not like men who poison livestock." He paused. "Whitmore's had him on a short lead for a long time. But a short lead and a loyal one aren't the same thing." They split the work. Marcus rode north toward the Holt Ranch. Eli went to see the constable. Clara drove the wagon into Coldwater Junction alone, which was either brave or reckless, and she suspected it was both, and went directly to Aldous Fenn's general store. The store was empty when she arrived, except for Fenn himself, who looked up at the sound of the bell and took in her appearance, the soot still in her hair, despite her best efforts. The burn mark on her left cuff, the particular expression of a woman who had been through something and was still moving and said nothing for a moment. "I heard smoke last night," he said finally, "from the ridge." "The barn's gone," she said. "We got the animals out." He set down what he was doing. "Both of you, both of us." He came around the counter. "You should sit down." "I don't have time to sit down." She looked at him steadily. "Aldous, what I'm about to tell you is going to require you to decide something. I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything you're not able to give, but I need you to listen first and decide after." He nodded slowly. She told him about the riders on the ridge. She told him that they had been identified, that Eli would be making a statement to the constable today, that Marcus Webb was already moving through the valley talking to people. She told him that a letter had gone to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago, and another was going today, and that this one would include the names of the men she had seen watching a burning barn from a hill. "The question," she said, "is whether this valley is going to let him say it never happened." Fenn was quiet for a long moment. "Then what do you need from me?" "You keep records," she said. "Purchase records, account records. You know who comes in here and when, and what they buy." She paused. "Kerosene. In large quantities recently." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to say anything that isn't true," she said. I'm asking whether something true exists to say. He turned and went to the ledger he kept behind the counter. She watched him run his finger down a column, pause, run it back up. 3 weeks ago, he said quietly. Garrett, 12 gallons. She let out a breath. Would you be willing to say that to the marshal? Fenn closed the ledger. He looked out his front window at the main street of the town he had lived in and served for 20 years, and she could see him calculating, not selfishly exactly, but with the careful arithmetic of a man who understood that speaking up had costs and was deciding whether the costs were ones he was willing to pay. I've been watching what Douglas Whitmore does to people in this valley for a long time, he said finally. I've been watching and selling him flour and telling myself it wasn't my business. He looked at her. You're right that I have records. And yes, I'll say it. Clara put her hand on the counter, not grabbing him, just placing it there. Thank you, Aldous. Don't thank me yet. He looked back out the window. He's going to push back hard when he finds out people are talking. Harder than before. I know. Are you ready for that? She thought of the barn collapsing behind her in the cold dark and Eli's hand on her arm in the yard afterward and the 5 horses tied to the fence post and everything the two of them had built on that ridge in the time since she'd knocked on a door half dead and been pulled inside. Yes, she said, I'm ready. Eli was coming out of the constable's office when she arrived back at the junction. The expression on his face told her something before he spoke, not relief but movement. Progress. Garrett wrote it down, she asked. More than that. Eli fell into step beside her. He'd already heard from Marcus, and Samuel Holt came in while I was there. He paused. There's something else. What? One of Whitmore's men came into town this morning before any of us got here. He looked at her. Not Garrett, one of the newer ones. Young, maybe 20. He went to the telegraph office and then he came to the constable's office and he asked to make a statement. She stopped walking. What kind of statement? He was there last night, one of the 4 on the ridge. Eli met her eyes. He said Whitmore gave the order directly, said he wanted the barn burned and that if anyone was inside when it happened, that was the cost of doing business. The phrase landed like a stone. The cost of doing business. He'll recant, she said. When Whitmore finds out, maybe, but it's on record now. Garrett's got it written down and witnessed. Eli paused. The young man's name is Henry Cole. He's from Ohio originally. Been working Whitmore's ranch for 8 months. He paused again. He's scared, but he's more scared of what comes next if he stays quiet than of Whitmore. Clara stood on the main street of Coldwater Junction in the cold morning air and looked at the buildings around her, the bank, the land office, the church with its crooked steeple, and understood that the landscape of this valley had shifted in the last 12 hours. Whitmore had pushed too hard. He had moved from the quietly deniable to the openly criminal, and in doing so had given the people who had been calculating whether to speak up a reason to decide that staying quiet was no longer the safer option. We need to get to Whitmore before he gets to Cole, she said. We can't, not physically. She turned to look at Eli. We need to make his position public before he can manage it. If the valley knows what Cole said, all of it today, then silencing Cole becomes an act so visible that even Whitmore can't afford it. Eli looked at her for a moment with the expression that had become over the past weeks one of her favorites, the one that meant he was seeing something he hadn't expected and finding it worth seeing. How, he said, the Cattlemen's Association meets on the last Friday of every month. She said, Fenn told me. Whitmore chairs it. She paused. Today is Thursday. You want to go to the meeting? I want to go to the meeting, stand up in front of every rancher in this valley and say what happened. All of it. With Fenn beside me and Marcus beside me and Cole's written statement in my hand. She held his gaze. Whitmore will be there because he chairs it. He'll have no warning. And every man in that room will hear the truth before he has a chance to shape it. The silence between them had the quality of a decision being made. That's either brilliant or insane, Eli said. Probably both, she agreed. Are you with me? He looked at her for one more moment. I've been with you since the porch, he said. I don't plan to stop now. The association met in the back room of the Coldwater Junction Hotel, a long, low-ceiling space with a plank floor and 2 iron stoves and rows of chairs that were almost entirely filled when Clara and Eli walked in at 7 o'clock on Friday evening. She had not given herself time to be afraid. Fear, she had learned, was a thing that grew in stillness, and she had not been still since the barn came down. The room went quiet in stages as people registered her presence not all at once, but in the spreading way of a stone dropped in water. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Douglas Whitmore, standing at the front of the room with the easy authority of a man on his own ground, looked up. His face gave nothing away. She had to credit him that. "Mr. Whitmore," Clara said from the back of the room. Her voice carried clearly. She had known it would. She had spent 6 years making herself heard over the noise of 300 looms. "I wonder if you might allow me a few minutes of the association's time." The room waited. Every eye moved between her and Whitmore doing the calculation. Whitmore smiled. It was the performance of graciousness, technically flawless. "Miss Marsh, of course." He gestured toward the front of the room. "Please." She walked to the front. Eli came with her, and Marcus was already there, had been there having arrived early, and taken a seat in the second row where his size and his 23 years in the valley were both immediately visible. Fenn was there too, near the door, his ledger under his arm. She turned to face the room. "2 nights ago," she said, "someone set fire to Eli Rourke's barn while we were inside. We got the animals out and got ourselves out, and we were fortunate enough not to die. Before we left the burning property, I saw 4 riders on the ridge above us, watching. I recognized 2 of them as men I had seen previously on Douglas Whitmore's property." She waited. "Yesterday morning," she continued, "a young man named Henry Cole came voluntarily to Constable Garrett's office and made a sworn statement that he was one of those 4 riders, that the fire was deliberate, and that the order to set it came directly from Douglas Whitmore." The room had the quality of held breath. "I also have—" She nodded to Fenn, who came forward with his ledger. "A record from Aldous Fenn's general store showing that 3 weeks ago, a man named Garrett, who is Whitmore's foreman's brother, purchased 12 gallons of kerosene. More kerosene than any reasonable ranch use requires in winter." She looked out at the assembled ranchers. "I am not here to make accusations. I am here to put these facts before you, because you are the men who have the most to lose if this valley allows one person to operate above the law for the sake of his own interests. I am also here to tell you that I have sent all of this to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, and that a deputy is expected within the week." The held breath released. Whitmore stepped forward. "This is Mr. Whitmore." Constable Garrett, who had been sitting quietly in the third row, stood up. He was a small man, nondescript, easily overlooked. He did not look easily overlooked now. "I have Henry Cole's statement in my official record. It's witnessed and filed. I'd advise you not to say anything that contradicts it in a public forum." The silence that followed was total. Clara watched Douglas Whitmore's face, watched the composure hold for a moment, then begin just barely, just at the edges to show the thing it was covering. Not fear exactly, something colder. The expression of a man who has spent a very long time being the person who decided how things went, confronting the moment when that capacity has been removed from him. "You have nothing," Whitmore said. His voice was still controlled. "A frightened boy's statement, a ledger entry, and the word of a woman who came to my property under false pretenses and then set up residence with an unmarried man." The room stirred. "I came to your property," Clara said, "under the terms of a written agreement that you drafted and then violated." Her voice was steady. "I have that agreement here." She held up the letter, the one she'd kept in the tin with her mother's locket through the blizzard and the week since. "I also have the receipt for the train ticket I bought with my own money, not yours, and the letter you wrote me that promised a home, a partnership in mutual respect. I have kept every word you put on paper, Mr. Whitmore, every word." She looked at the room. "This man sent me out into a January blizzard because I failed to meet his standards," she said. "He sent riders to my home in the night to threaten me. He cut the water to Eli Rourke's south pasture. He poisoned livestock. He attempted to purchase my silence with money and intimidate it with lawyers." She paused. "And when none of that worked, he burned a barn with 2 people inside it and had men watch from the ridge to make sure the job was done." She set the letter on the table at the front of the room, the physical weight of it, something real that could be picked up and read. "I am not asking you to take my word for any of this," she said. "I am asking you to look at the record. And then I am asking you to decide what kind of valley you want to live in." The room was silent. Then Samuel Holt from the middle of the row stood up. "I've had trouble with Whitmore's water contracts myself," he said in the flat, factual way of a man reading from an account book. "3 years ago, I didn't say anything because I thought it wasn't worth the fight." He paused. "I was wrong." A beat. Then a rancher named Dunleavy stood. Then another man Clara didn't know. Then Fenn, though he was already standing. Whitmore looked at the room, at the men rising one by one, not loudly, not with any drama, just standing, just making themselves visible. "This is over," he said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." Jayagam. He didn't leave quietly. She hadn't expected him to. Men like Whitmore didn't exit anything quietly. They exited through lawyers and appeals and the procedural instruments of delay that money made available. He left the hotel that night with 2 of his remaining men and rode back to his ranch. And by the next morning, there was a letter at the constable's office from his attorney in Laramie, citing procedural irregularities in the statement-taking process and requesting that all records be sealed pending review. Garrett filed the letter and did nothing else. 2 days later, the territorial deputy arrived. His name was Alderman, a quiet man of 50 with a marshal's badge and the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen enough fraudulent urgency to be unimpressed by it. He read the complete record. Garrett's files, Fenn's ledger, Cole's statement, the letters from Cheyenne and back. And then he rode out to the Rourke ranch and walked the site of the barn and asked questions. His questions were specific. His expression throughout was that of a man processing information rather than reaching predetermined conclusions. When he was done, he thanked them and rode back to town. That evening, Marcus came to the cabin with the news. "Alderman's placed Whitmore under a hold," he said, "restricted to the county pending investigation. Can't move assets or property." He sat down heavily in the chair by the fire, the big man, looking for the first time since Clara had known him, simply tired in the way of someone who has been tensed against something for a long time and is only now allowed to loosen. It's not a rest, not yet, but it's the beginning of the end. Clara sat across from him with her coffee and tried to feel the thing she expected to feel. Relief, maybe, or triumph. What she felt instead was something quieter, a kind of settling, the way the ground felt after a long frost when the thaw finally came, not dramatic, just real. "Cole," she said. "What happens to him?" He'll be protected," Marcus said. Alderman was clear about that. "He's a witness, not an accused." He paused. "Kid made a hard call. He'll land all right." She nodded. Eli, who had been standing at the window through all of this, came and sat down beside her. Not close, the careful distance they had maintained through everything, the distance that meant something different now than it had a month ago, but beside her. His presence, the specific, steady thing it had always been. "It's not over," he said, "not legally." "No," Marcus agreed. "Whitmore's lawyer will fight everything. It'll take months, maybe longer." "But it's over here," Clara said. "In this valley." She looked at Marcus. "He's done." Marcus nodded slowly. "He's done." The fire crackled. Outside, the winter dark was absolute and cold and full of stars. "I want to rebuild the barn," Clara said, "as soon as the ground allows." "Spring," Eli said. "Maybe late March if the weather holds." "I want it bigger," she said. "Better, something that lasts." He looked at her sidelong. "Something that lasts," he repeated. She met his eyes. "Yes." And in the look that passed between them, the specific accumulated weight of everything they had been through since the January blizzard and a knock on a stranger's door, the word meant more than the barn. March came in hard and then softened, the way Wyoming months often did, a week of brutal cold, followed by 3 days of pale sun that had enough warmth in it to make the snow believe it could melt. The creek above the south pasture ran freely for the first time since November, and the cattle moved differently in the thaw light, with the unhurried purposefulness of animals that no longer had to fight every step. Clara stood at the cabin window in the early morning of the first genuinely warm day and watched the valley below come back to itself, and felt something she had difficulty naming. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness seemed too light a word for what this was. Something more structural. The sense of having arrived somewhere she was allowed to stay. The investigation into Douglas Whitmore had expanded since Deputy Alderman's visit, in the way that investigations expand when the first stone is overturned and reveals not just the expected insects but an entire ecosystem. 3 water contract disputes dating back 6 years had been reopened. The Laramie Land Records Office had sent a man to review the filing history on 4 separate parcels that Whitmore had acquired in ways that were at minimum worth examining. Henry Cole had given 2 more statements and had been quietly relocated to a ranch 2 counties north with Alderman's office watching his back. Whitmore himself had not been seen in Coldwater Junction in 3 weeks. His attorney came and went, filing papers and making arguments and doing the work that money made available, but Whitmore himself stayed on his property, and the quality of his staying there felt less like command and more like refuge. The valley had not forgotten, which was what mattered. The letter from the marshal's office arrived on a Tuesday addressed to Clara Marsh and Eli Rourke, jointly in care of the Coldwater Junction post office. Carr, the postmaster, held it out to her over the counter with an expression of dignified restraint that barely concealed his curiosity. She read it outside, standing on the boardwalk in the thin March sun. It was straightforward and official, and contained in the particular language of territorial legal process the information that Douglas Whitmore had been formally charged with arson, criminal harassment, and water rights fraud, that a trial date had been set for May in the Laramie Territorial Court, that her testimony and Eli's would be required, and that the office would arrange their transportation and accommodation, that Henry Cole's statement had been formally entered into the record and was considered essential to the case. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood on the boardwalk and let the sun touch her face for a moment. She thought about the letter she had received in Pittsburgh, in a different coat, in a different life. The one that had promised a home and a partnership and mutual respect. The one she had read 100 times on the train west and held up to the window light in Nebraska and told herself meant what it said. She thought about what she had found instead. Not the thing the letter had promised, but something truer than anything a letter could carry. She went to find Eli. He was in the space where the barn had been, which was no longer a ruin and not yet a structure, but something in between. The site cleared the foundation posts, sunk the first courses of new lumber, rising from the frozen ground with the specific promise of something under construction. He had been at it since first light, and Marcus Webb was beside him, and Samuel Holt, and 2 of the Dunleavy brothers, and a young man from the Holt Ranch whose name Clara was still learning. She had learned over the past weeks that this was how the valley expressed things it didn't have a formal language for. Not in speeches or ceremonies, but in the showing up, in the bringing of lumber, in the knowledge of how to use it, in the quiet company of men who had decided that this was where they were supposed to be this particular morning. She stood at the edge of the site and watched for a moment before Eli saw her. He came over, wiping sawdust from his hands. She held out the letter. He read it, looked up, read it again. May, he said, May. He folded it carefully and held it for a moment, a gesture she recognized as the one he made when he was finding the right footing for something. Then he handed it back to her. How do you feel? He asked. Like it's real now, she said. Before it was something we were fighting for. Now it's something that's happening. He nodded slowly. Different. Very. She looked at the rising frame of the barn. Good different. He turned to follow her gaze, and they stood together for a moment in the sun, with the sound of hammering around them, and the smell of new-cut pine in the cold air, and the valley spread out below the ridge in its recovering spring state, the snow retreating up the higher slopes, the lower pastures showing the first tentative green. Marcus wants to add a second loft, Eli said. Says the current design doesn't give enough hay storage for a herd this size. He's right, Clara said. You'll want to expand the herd once the water rights are properly secured. The water claim went through yesterday, he said. Garrett filed it. With Whitmore restricted from the county, the commission didn't have anyone telling them what to decide. She felt the small satisfaction of that one more thing settling into its right place. Then we add the second loft, she said. He almost smiled. We'll need to recalculate the beam support. I know. She paused. I looked at it this morning. The east wall post spacing needs to come in by 14 inches to compensate. He looked at her with the expression she had come to love, not the rare full smile, but the compressed warmth of it, the thing that said she had surprised him in a way he found entirely welcome. You looked at it this morning, he said. I've been looking at the design for 2 weeks. She kept her voice matter-of-fact because she had learned that was how he preferred things said clearly and without performance. I have opinions. I know you have opinions, he said. I count on it. She looked up at him in the March sun. This man who had pulled her out of a blizzard and asked for nothing, and then given her everything that mattered, and felt the wall, the one that had been standing since Pittsburgh, since the looms and the dust, and the years of being invisible finally and completely come down. Eli, she said. Yes. I'm done waiting. He went still in the particular way he did when something required his full attention. Not frozen, just present, completely present. Waiting for what, he said, though from his expression she thought he knew. For it to be safe, she said, to trust this, to trust you, to stop being the woman who came west on a letter and lost everything and decided that wanting things was how you got hurt. She held his gaze. I've been safe my whole life, and it nearly killed me. I'm done with safe. He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that always told the truth. I'm not safe, he said. I'm difficult, and I don't talk enough, and I've spent 8 years being very carefully unavailable to anyone who might matter. I know, she said. I've spent 8 months watching you be all of that. And you're still damn. I'm still here, she said. I walked 15 miles through a blizzard, and I'm still here, and I have opinions about barn design, and I have apparently decided that you are worth the risk. She paused. I would appreciate it if you felt the same way. The hammering from the barn site had stopped. She didn't look to see if anyone was watching. It didn't matter. Eli Rourke looked at her, this woman who had knocked on his door half dead in January and rebuilt half his ranch and faced down a powerful man in a public meeting and reorganized the geometry of his entire interior life. And she saw the moment when the last of his careful distance dissolved. He reached out and took her face in his hands, gentle and certain, and kissed her. Behind them, someone Marcus, she suspected, or possibly Samuel Holt, let out a low sound that was somewhere between approval and amusement. She didn't look. She was too busy with more important things. When they separated, the March sun was on both of them, and the valley was green and waking below. Finally, Marcus Webb said from approximately 15 feet away, and went back to work. The trial was set for the 3rd week of May, but by the 2nd week of April, it had already effectively concluded in the way that trials sometimes did, when the weight of evidence became sufficient to collapse the structure of denial around it. Whitmore's attorney, a capable man named Fletcher, who had built a respectable career on the backs of clients with money and the patience to wait out opposition, filed a motion to dismiss on procedural grounds in early April. The motion was denied. He filed a second motion challenging the chain of custody on the Fenn ledger. Also denied, he arranged for 2 witnesses to provide statements contradicting Cole's account. The statements were reviewed by Alderman's office, found to contain several specific factual errors that were verifiable through independent records and formally noted as unreliable. By the 15th of April, Fletcher had a conversation with his client that Clara would never hear directly, but would piece together from its consequences. 3 days after that conversation, Whitmore entered a formal guilty plea on the arson charge. The water fraud charges and the harassment charges remained pending, and the process of unwinding 6 years of contracts and filings would take considerably longer than the spring. But the thing that had hung over the cold water valley, the particular weight of a powerful man operating without consequence, had been removed. The valley breathed differently. Clara was in town when the news came through at Fenn's store, picking up flour and the lamp oil they'd run low on. Carr, the postmaster, came in with the paper from Laramie, and Fenn read the relevant section aloud in the quiet of the store, and then he looked at Clara and said nothing for a moment. You started this, he said finally. We started it, she said. No. He shook his head, but gently, the way of a man making a careful distinction. You started it, the rest of us joined. There's a difference. She thought about arguing. Then she thought about the 15 miles she had walked in January, with a dead lantern and a canvas bag and a decision not to quit, and she let him have the point. They married in June, not because either of them had particularly strong feelings about ceremony, but because Marcus Webb had been making pointed remarks about it since March, and Mrs. Aldridge had taken it upon herself to organize something whether they liked it or not, and at some point the path of least resistance was simply to show up. The ceremony was short and in the open air on the ridge above the Coldwater Valley, on a morning when the sky was the deep blue of high summer, and the new barn stood complete behind them, its second loft already half full with the first cutting of hay. Constable Garrett officiated, having recently obtained the necessary credential, which he seemed to regard as a point of quiet personal satisfaction. The whole valley came, or something close to it. Marcus stood near the front with his arms crossed in his expression of controlled emotion that he had apparently decided was the appropriate affect for public occasions of this kind. Samuel Holt brought his wife and 3 daughters. Aldous Fenn brought his ledger, which Clara suspected he went nowhere without. The Dunleavy brothers brought a cured ham. Henry Cole, who had returned from his 2-county exile now that the need for it had passed, stood near the back and looked like a young man who had made a hard choice and was discovering that hard choices sometimes led somewhere good. Mrs. Aldridge came and sat in the front row and cried, which was unexpected enough that Clara found herself oddly moved by it. Whatever the woman's failings in January, there was something genuine in the weeping, and Clara had learned enough about hard country to know that genuine things deserved acknowledgement. The vows were simple. Eli had written his and read them from a card in his careful, unhurried handwriting, specific and honest in the way everything he did was specific and honest, without flourish, but with the full weight of a man who meant every word. "I am not easy," he said, looking at her. "I know that. You know it better than I do. But I have never been more certain of anything than I am of you, and I intend to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never regret that walk in the dark." She had not prepared specific words. She had thought she would, and then she had found sitting with a question in the weeks before that what she wanted to say was not something that fit neatly into prepared language. She took his hands. "You opened a door," she said. "You didn't ask who I was or what I'd done or whether I was worth the trouble. You just pulled me in out of the cold and fed me and told me I could stay." She looked up at him. "That is who you are. And I want to spend the rest of my life living somewhere that is worthy of that." Marcus Webb made a sound. Several other people made sounds. Mrs. Aldridge wept harder. Garrett pronounced them married with the efficiency of a man who had filled out enough paperwork to know that the important part was the record. Eli kissed her in the June sun with the valley spread out below them and the new barns strong at their backs, and the horses all 5 healthy and gently exasperated by the crowd watching from the pasture fence, with the specific expression of animals that have seen a great deal of human drama and found most of it mildly ridiculous. That evening, after the celebrating and the ham, in the 3 hours of conversation that followed in the yard of the ranch, they sat together on the porch in the long June twilight and watched the valley go from gold to rose to purple. The stars came out slowly, one at a time, and then all at once the way they always did up here where the air was thin and clear and the darkness was honest. "Is it what you expected?" Eli asked. She knew what he meant, not the wedding, not the evening, but all of it. The whole improbable chain of events that had started with a letter in Pittsburgh and ended here. "No," she said, "it's better." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything." "I know." He turned to look at her. "But I want to. I want you to know." He paused, finding the words in the way he always did without rushing. "You came here with nothing, less than nothing, and you built something. Not just the ranch, not just the case against Whitmore. You built this. The valley talking to itself, people deciding they'd rather stand than keep their heads down. You did that." "We did that," she said. "You started it." She thought of Fenn saying the same thing in the store and turned it over in her mind. The starting of things, the decision made in a snowstorm with a dead lantern and no certainty of survival to keep moving toward the only light visible. "I was looking for a home," she said. "That's all I was doing. Everything else, Whitmore, the letters, the trial, that was just what was in the way." And now she looked at the valley in its summer dark, the creek she could hear but not see the new barn, the horses at the fence line, the stars above the Absaroka range. She looked at the man beside her, scarred and reticent, and completely certain, the man who had pulled her out of the cold without asking why. "Now I'm home," she said. He reached over and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand finding another hand in the dark, the simplest possible act of belonging. They stayed on the porch until the night settled completely around them, the stars thick overhead and the valley quiet below, and neither of them needed to say anything more because everything had already been said in the only ways that actually mattered, in the acts of showing up, in the decision to stay, in the stubborn, ordinary, miraculous refusal to disappear.